Early one April morning, 3,000 years ago, in a place called Goshen in the land of Egypt, a great crowd of people set off on foot into the desert. The people were the Israelites, and they had been exiled in Egypt and treated as slaves. But on that morning, Pharaoh, the king of the land, had finally granted them their freedom. And as dawn broke over Egypt, they were anxious and full of hope. Never before had there been such an exodus of people. 600,000 men and women, moving through the mud streets with goats and sheep and pack mules bundled high with belongings. And at the very front of the file, leading the people with a shepherd's staff, was the man who had won the Israelites their freedom. His name was Moses. "Where will you lead us, now that we are leaving Egypt?" a young boy asked Moses. "It is God who leads us," Moses said, "to the land he promised our ancestors, a land called Canaan, which flows with milk and honey." And with that, God created a pillar of cloud to lead the Israelites from Egypt. And later that night, a pillar of fire unfurled from the heavens to light their path. And in this way, God led the people for days and nights south along the Red Sea, where they camped one evening beside the coast. Now, all this time, Pharaoh's spies had been watching the Israelites. And when they saw the men camped beside the sea with no protection, they hurried back to tell Pharaoh. Pharaoh was still in mourning, for his son had recently died when God passed over Egypt and killed the firstborn Egyptians. Yet as his courtiers urged him on, Pharaoh's sorrow hardened to anger, and he resolved to wreak revenge on the Israelites. Finally, he sent 600 charioteers after the Israelites. Before long, Pharaoh's army reached the Red Sea. And when the Israelites heard the thunderous horse hooves and the cries of the cavalrymen, they cowered in fear. "Moses," they cried, "why have you brought us here to be slaughtered like sheep?" "Fear not," Moses replied. "Stand firm and see what salvation your God works for you today." And with that, Moses waved his shepherd's staff over the sea, and God made a fierce wind blow and whipped the water into high white caps. The sea separated, and a sleeve of dry land opened in the center. Moses sent the Israelites upon the dry land, and the water stood on each side like two walls, hundreds of feet high. And God placed a pillar of cloud behind the people, so that it was like a thick curtain through which the Egyptians could not pass. All night long, the Israelites fled through the parted sea. In the morning, when they had all passed to the other shore, God lifted the pillar of cloud, and the Egyptians poured into the separated sea in angry pursuit. And just as they were halfway across, Moses again waved his staff over the sea. This time God made the walls of water crumble upon themselves. Within seconds, the Egyptians and their chariots were swallowed by the sea. That evening, the Israelites left the coast and journeyed inland. They trusted God and were pleased with Moses. But the next day, the sun grew hot, and the day after it grew even hotter, and for 3 days the Israelites saw no water. When they finally found a well, the water was too bitter to drink, so they complained to Moses. Now God heard the murmuring of the Israelites, and he showed Moses the branch of a tree, and told him to throw it into the well. And when Moses did so, the water turned sweet and drinkable. So the people filled their skins and watered their flocks, and set out again into the wilderness. But after 15 days they grew hungry, and began to complain again to Moses. "Moses," they moaned, "in Egypt we had melons and quail and cucumbers. Here we have nothing. Would it not have been better to stay slaves in Egypt than die here of hunger?" God heard the murmuring of the Israelites. And the next morning, fine flakes fell with the dew and covered the hillsides like frost. The Israelites went out and gathered the flakes, which tasted to them like wafers of honey. "What is it, Moses?" they asked. "This is manna. It is God's bread, which he has brought down for us to eat in the desert." So the Israelites gathered the manna every morning, and they ground it into meal and made cakes from it. After many days, they reached a place called Rephidim, and again there was no water in sight. "Moses, why have you taken us from Egypt, that we should die of thirst in the desert?" By this time, Moses was growing weary of the people's complaints, and he lashed out against them. "How can you still not believe that God will provide after all the wonders he has performed for you?" But the people didn't listen and complained more bitterly than before. So with his shepherd's staff, Moses struck a large rock, and God made a great stream of water spring from it, and the people drank once again. And so the Israelites journeyed onward through the desert in the dry dust of the afternoons. And in 3 months they reached Mount Sinai, and there they set up camp. One evening Moses went up Mount Sinai, and God spoke to him. "Moses," God said, "you have seen the miracles I have worked for you, how I brought you out of Egypt. Tell your people that if they keep my commandments and obey my laws, I shall choose them above all other nations as my own." Moses walked back to camp that night and told the Israelites what God had said. All the people answered as one, saying, "All that the Lord said we will do." Then Moses said in 3 days God would appear on the mountain so the Israelites could hear him. So for 3 days the people prepared themselves for God. On the 3rd day, thunderheads rolled and massed over Mount Sinai, and lightning fell from the clouds. A trumpet blast blared from the heavens, and the entire mountain fumed like a furnace in flame. Moses went up the mountain, and there God spoke his 10 commandments. "I am the Lord God," he said, "who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other God but me. You shall not make idols or bow down to them or serve them. You shall not swear falsely by my name. You shall remember to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You shall honor your father and mother. You shall not murder nor commit adultery. You shall not steal nor tell lies about a neighbor. And you shall not covet your neighbor's house or anything else which belongs to your neighbor. These are my commandments. The mountain fell silent. Then God himself engraved each one of his commandments upon 2 tablets of stone, so the Israelites would not forget them. For several days and nights Moses remained on the mountainside, while God explained his laws and how the Israelites should behave, and how they should build an ark and a tabernacle in which to keep the tablets of the law. And after many days had passed, and Moses remained on the mountain, the people back in camp grew restless. Where was Moses, they wondered? Why has he not yet returned? More days passed, then weeks, with no sign of Moses, until the people thought he had abandoned them, and that God had left them as well. So they went to Moses' brother Aaron and said, "Aaron, make us gods we can see, and thus believe in." So Aaron gathered their gold jewelry and bracelets and melted them down and fashioned a molten calf, smooth as polished stone. And the Israelites exclaimed, "These are our gods, who brought us out of the land of Egypt." Now after 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, Moses began his journey back to camp. He held in his hands the 2 tablets of the law, a gift to his people from God. When he'd reached the lower embankments of the mountain, he heard music from the Israelite camp and saw festal fires and people dancing. Then he saw the Israelites bowing before a towering altar upon which stood the golden calf. Moses' anger was uncontrollable. He cast the 2 tablets down upon the foot of the mountain, and they crashed in 1,000 shards. Then he smashed the golden calf from its pedestal, and ground the gold into a powder and scattered it over the camp. "Why have you so disobeyed God's commandments, the very ones he has just given us? Now surely he will destroy us all." The people wept with fear like children, and hid their faces and begged for forgiveness. And the next morning Moses climbed the mountain once again, hoping to find favor with God and atone for the Israelites' sins. But on the mountain, God's anger burned hotly. He knew the Israelites were faithless. "Get your people away from my sight. Take them to the land I promised you. But I shall no longer go with them, lest I destroy them in my anger." Moses despaired at God's words. How could the people go through the harsh desert without their God? So Moses laid himself flat upon the ground and pleaded for his people, begging for God to go with them. At last, God's anger softened, and he agreed to go with the Israelites. But from now on, he would punish them if they disobeyed. God then told Moses to carve 2 new tablets of stone, on which he would again engrave his laws, and the covenant was once again restored. After 2 years at Mount Sinai, the Israelites struck camp and again set out for the Promised Land. They left at the end of summer, when the locusts were loud in the tamarisk trees, and the days were cooling down. And after a short time, Moses sent a party of spies to scout the land of Canaan, the land God had promised. The spies went up to Canaan, and after 40 days returned, carrying a cluster of grapes tied to a pole and a basket full of figs and pomegranates. "These are the fruits of the Promised Land," they said, passing around the basket and explaining that the land was fertile and full of good pasture. The people cheered and begged to hear more. "It is a fine land," another of the spies said, "but the people who live there are heavily armed, and surely will defeat us in battle." With that, the Israelites raised a cry of horror and cursed God. "What kind of a promised land is this, that we should be killed there? Why did we ever leave Egypt, Moses?" And just as the people were picking up rocks with which to stone Moses, God descended on the camp in a thick cloud and spoke to Moses. "How long will these people not trust me?" God said. "They are stubborn, and I shall slay them on this spot, for they surely will never have faith in me." Moses quickly fell to his face and pleaded with God to spare his people. And as before, God found favor with Moses, and as before he relented. But this time he punished the Israelites, as he said he would. From that moment on, the Israelites were forced to wander the desert for 40 years because of their faithlessness. And the older generation would die off in the desert, and only the very young who had no memory of Egypt and dared not question God would enter the Promised Land. And so, chastened, the Israelites went on. They sojourned in the desert, on the flat lands, and the fallow terraces and fired basins. The seasons slipped by, and the years passed too. Small children grew into men and women. The elders passed on, and they fought many battles along the way, and grew stronger as a nation. In the 40th year, they found an acacia grove in the country of Moab. There they rested in the cool of the shade to hear Moses speak. Now Moses was an old man by then, his forehead furrowed with age, his beard white as winter frost. And in the grove he gave the Israelites their laws for the second time, while every person listened, from the very young who could not speak, to the wizened and withered who could no longer walk. For 40 years, Moses said, you have wandered in the wilderness, not only as punishment for your sins, but also that God might humble you and test your heart. He let you hunger, that you may know that everything proceeds from the mouth of God. And he disciplined you, so that you may obey his laws and fear him. Now you are ready to enter the Promised Land. And it is a good land, of brooks and springs, and valleys of vines and bread. So go now to the land promised you, and be careful to keep God's commandments during all your days. And with that, Moses rose from their midst and walked out into the evening. And as he went among them, every person stood in silence as he passed. The next day, God called Moses up to Mount Nebo so that he could look upon the promised land before he died. It was springtime then. The cows were gravid with calves, and the wind blew back the juniper bushes and brought the smell of jonquils up from the valley. From the mountain top, Moses could see the buds blossoming on the olive branches, and the river Jordan, running in the east as clear and blue as cobalt. And though he knew he would never arrive there, he smiled, for he had finally seen the promised land and felt its cooling breeze upon his brow, and he knew the Israelites would be there soon. And after he had seen it, Moses died on Mount Nebo in the land of Moab. He was 120 years old that day. And there has not risen a prophet like him since, whom God knew face to face, and gave signs and wonders to perform before all the people of Israel.